The power of identity. That's the subject of this week's episode of the What's Wrong with America podcast. I'm your host, Daniel D. It is Monday, February 21st, 2022, also known as President's Day in the United States. So happy birthday. It's George Washington and Abe Lincoln. In spite of the attempts to cancel those guys, their legacy remains important. Especially George Washington. You know, there's a lot of things like, if we're talking about what could have happened differently, like that dude really could have assumed kind of dictatorial powers if he wanted to. If he had wanted to become practically a king, or, you know, he could have done it. You know, he was one of the few people that had the opportunity to seize power and really voluntarily laid it down. Didn't want to hold on to it. Didn't want to, you know, that's admirable. I don't care what you say. You know, whatever other flaws he may have had, you know, that he shared with other people of his time, he had some real principles, some real values that he did live his life by, you know. Again, not perfect, but you got to commend that, especially when you see people today who are the complete opposite of that, right? They're, you know, all about seizing and maintaining power, and they would rather sink the whole ship than give up the captain's seat. You know, they would rather be in the captain's seat on a vessel that's already hit the iceberg or is, you know, about to capsize and sink, you know, than to be just a regular passenger or regular, you know, whatever, sailor on board a vessel that's solid and airtight and going where it needs to go. You know, anyway. So we need more George Washingtons. We need less Joe Bidens and, you know, anybody else now who's all about themselves and their own power and prestige and everything like that. But anyway, this episode I'm going to talk instead not about presidents like George Washington, but about identity. And because I think identity is the major driver behind a lot of what people do in modern times. A lot of the stuff that we see socially, culturally, politically, that seems like it's a battle of, I don't know, economics or religion or whatever. It's really a battle of identity. And people trying to validate themselves to themselves almost in terms of the identity they have. This episode is brought to you by Libsyn, Liberated Syndicate. If you're thinking about podcasting, well, go for it. You know, you only live once, might as well podcast something while you're here, right? So if you use promo code DanielD at checkout, you can get up to 2 free months of podcast hosting. Go to signup.libsyn.com, use promo code DanielD, or just click on the link in the show notes, which will already have the promo code built in, so you can get your 2 free months of podcast hosting when you sign up. So again, check that in the show notes, use that link, get 2 free months of podcast hosting. So the power of identity. And this is one of the things that I've been thinking about lately. It's similar to what Viktor Frankl said in Man's Search for Meaning, which if you have not read that book, it is really one that is worth reading. You know, if just briefly recap that, like Dr. Frankl was a Viennese psychotherapist. He's also Jewish, and like a lot of Jews, he got thrown into the concentration camps by the Nazis. He survived, you know, lost pretty much all his family, including his wife. I don't think they had any children yet, but she died, and you know, a lot of his extended, you know, his immediate family perished in the camps as well. But what was interesting about him is because he had this training as a psychotherapist, it's like he got to test, you know, these ideas in real time in the most challenging circumstances you can imagine, you know, and see what works, what doesn't work. What do the people who persevere and make it through even those hellish circumstances and are able to survive, not just survive, but to survive with their soul intact, for lack of a better term, right? Not get crushed and completely overwhelmed by their circumstances, however horrible those circumstances were. And he wrote it down in Man's Search for Meaning. Freaking phenomenal book. If you haven't read it, you should. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. It'll be an Amazon affiliate link, so yeah. Normal rules with that apply. If you buy anything, Jeff Bezos will kick a little bit back to me at no additional cost to you, but there'll be a link to Man's Search for Meaning in the show notes. And if you don't want to shop Amazon, you owe it to yourself to check that book out at whatever other bookstore you use. But Man's Search for Meaning, great book. But anyway, he identified in Man's Search for Meaning of that is like people, when they talk about economics or about human psychology, there's a lot of emphasis on, these needs or wants that we have for like food, water, shelter, social status, power, security, that kind of thing. But he's saying that really the search for meaning or the need for meaning is even greater and more foundational than that. Because a lot of some people will say, like, according to the, Maslow's, hierarchy of needs, right? So it's like you got if you don't have enough to eat, you're not going to worry about, your social standing. Like there's these kind of, you got to take care of your physical needs before you take care of your emotional needs, before you take care of your spiritual needs. And Frankl was pretty much like, that's not true. Even if you're starving, which they were in the concentration camps, even if you're being sleep deprived and, tortured physically, like you don't even have shoes on and you're trudging through snow, like those guys face some brutal inhumanity in the Holocaust. But even in spite of that, people still had a need for some kind of spiritual meaning in their lives, and if you have a belief in God, that's better. And I say better as in not just, better in terms of philosophically or whatever, but I mean better in the sense of like more meaningful or rewarding or beneficial, really. Like if your meaning was like, well, I enjoy the work that I do and I think it helps people, well, now you're in a concentration camp. I mean, not to say that you shouldn't aim for that in your work, but now you're in a concentration camp and you're doing slave labor. So like, that's gone. What about family relationships? I mean, again, great thing to have, meaningful, but now you're in a concentration camp. What is that going to do for you other than give you maybe a reason to fight, to survive? Like, hey, I hope that if I survive, I can be reunited with my family, right? So there's that. But really, there's like this, he said, and there's a few quotes where he said it so well. And these, I don't even have the book in front of me. I'm just going to, from heart, say, from memory. One of them that really stuck with me was this one, where he said, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but he said that much has been made of the fact that man is the being that created the gas ovens at Auschwitz, right? But man is also the same being that entered those gas ovens upright with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips. And that really captures something profound about the human condition. Yes, there's this evil in the world. Yes, there's man's inhumanity to man. But even in the world's darkest, most depraved places, there are enough people. And this is another quote that I'm going to paraphrase. Though they may be few in number, he said, there are enough people who gave comfort, who gave their last crumb of bread to somebody else who was starving or who was worse off than themselves. These acts of kindness, though they might not have been, the norm, there was enough instances of them that you could see that even if all the other freedoms that you have are stripped away, there still remains one final freedom. The freedom to choose your own way. The freedom to decide, how am I going to respond to the circumstances that I find myself in? Am I going to be a demon because it's easy, because I'm in this diabolical situation? Or am I going to respond with love, compassion, seek God and seek to be an instrument in God's hands here, even here in a concentration camp? So, those type of statements, there's many more such ones like that. Like if you read the book, there are so many things that you underline and say, wow, this is profound. And it's really true that, this meaning, this desire for meaning. I'm going to say there's also a thing, and these two are related really, a desire for identity, and here it's meaning maybe vicariously, but meaning, and so maybe it's just a manifestation of this man's search for meaning. But there's this, and I'm going to bring this back down to earth in just a minute. I'm philosophical right now, but I'm going to get concrete in just a second. There's a desire to identify with something meaningful, right? And this can take, a lot of times it takes the place of a religious belief or conviction. You believe in God, you believe that even if you die, your soul or some part of yourself goes on, that God makes something ultimately good and meaningful and lasting out of your life, out of your being, right? So this is kind of like a search for meaning, but it's like an identification with something or someone capable of giving you that kind of meaning, right? So people need that, and if you don't have something that you identify with or as, right? If you don't have an identity, if you're not convinced within yourself of who and you are and what you believe in as being valuable and good, if you don't have a vision for yourself in your own life of what your best possible self is, that kind of thing, somebody's going to try to sell you one, and you're going to need one. You're going to be vulnerable to it. That's why when people have these, we're social creatures, right? So one of the things we identify with, our tribe, our team, our ethnicity, our country, our, whatever, our team, right? So there's these, I think if you look at humanity, you can't really I'm just going to take it as a given that people need something to identify with, because I think it's so clear that that's the case. And I've not come across any solid, credible evidence that people don't need some kind of identity, like forming an identity. This is who I am, and this is what I'm about, and this is what my values are. Like, that is so fundamental to human development in terms of the psychology, spirituality, whatever. Like, I'm just going to take it as a given, because I've yet to hear anybody really credibly say that that's not the case. I mean, the people that want to give the economics arguments about people just want things and they just consume things, it's like, yeah, that's a really one-dimensional view of humanity. Maybe some people are like that, but there's enough people that aren't, that can't be the whole story, right? Like, people, it's a powerful thing. This is why wars get fought a lot of times. Religious movements happen and die out and get replaced by different religious movements. Like, people really, they look at the world around them. They need something to identify with. There's that psalm, where David talks about, asking God, Lord, lead me to the rock that is higher than myself. When my heart is overwhelmed within me, Lord, lead me to the rock that is higher than myself, right? There's that desire for something, and a lot of times it takes the place of like explicitly a religious, spiritual belief, belief in God, some kind of spiritual practice. But it can also be just something bigger, like there's that thing, give yourself to a cause greater than yourself or whatever, right? All right, so this is where I'm coming back to the power of identity. That I would say there's like an axis, or a spectrum here, where you have on the one hand easy but empty, and on the other hand you have meaningful but hard. And I guess you could say there's two axes here. There's the easy versus difficult, and there's the empty versus meaningful. Now, what you would want, ideally, is stuff that's meaningful, And there's some things, some aspects of that may be easy, but a lot of it may be actually hard. Like, it's going to have to really mean something in your life. You can't just say it a few times a week on Sunday and then this is it. The rest of the week you go live in complete contradiction of what you profess on Sunday, right? Like, that's not a real fundamentally true reflection of who you are. So you may identify with it, but it's not real. It's not genuine, right? But there are things that may be easy to identify with that may be meaningful, right? Like, if you're, a child, you identify with your family. You're probably your nuclear family and your extended family. You identify to some extent with that. It's probably easy as a child, and hopefully, unless you have shitty parents and a lot of people do, but but that's just one thing that could be easy. If you're a kid living in a reasonably healthy, functionable family, you identify with your family, it's easy to identify with them. You don't really have to do a lot at that point in your life. You just kind of are part of the family. They naturally accept you, right? So that would be an example of that. There's things that are easy but empty, and that's probably the biggest category of things that are easy to identify with, but really at the end of the day, what good does it do anybody? And this would be your person who's like a nominal Christian, right? They go to church once a week, or maybe not even once a week. Maybe they go to church on Christmas and Easter, right? But a day-to-day basis, they're really not. There's no difference between them and somebody who doesn't even believe and doesn't even go to church. It's just kind of a cultural thing. Maybe you do it because you were raised Catholic, for example. You're Irish or you're Italian or whatever, and this is just what part of our culture going back centuries, right? And so it's like during Lent, you do the Stations of the Cross, not because you necessarily believe in it, because it's just that's what we do, right? That's one thing, and at that point, it could become meaningful potentially, if it becomes real to you based on your own lived encounter with something genuine that you encounter through that tradition. So in the case of, say, you believe in God, which I believe in God, so let's say that you encounter God in a setting, whether it's a Catholic church doing the Stations of the Cross during Lent, or whether it's a Pentecostal church, they're praying in tongues, or whether it's, you're Jewish and you've been raised Jewish, you studied the Torah and all that, and it never really meant anything to you, but at some point in your life, you're searching and you are reading, I don't know, story about Abraham, right? And somehow something in that story really resonates with you, and you're like, I see myself in a new light as being Jewish, or something like that, right? Then again, I think in those moments, there's something above and beyond the specific words or rituals or any of that. You're encountering God, I believe, others may disagree with that, but you encounter something more real. And so something that is kind of easy but empty can become meaningful but the thing is if it becomes meaningful, a lot of times you're going to have to work at it. Especially if you're above a certain age, right? Like if you're an adult in a family, it's not just something that you can just take for granted the way you can when you're a kid. Right, you'd have to work at being a parent, work at being a spouse, work at being a good family member, maintaining relationships with others in your family, or friendships or whatever, right? So I would say that you have some things that are meaningful but hard in terms of identity, and you have a lot of things that are easy but empty. Now, our culture, there's this existential crisis or vacuum in the West, in America, that seeps down over the last 100 years or longer, 200 years maybe, from the academy, right? Like in the late 1800s, the beliefs and attitudes that you may have found in a philosophy department at a university in Europe or the United States, right? That attitude and those values have now seeped down throughout the culture. They from the philosophy departments and the, some of the other departments in the modern university, they made it to the arts, and the Hollywood and literary types, and then from there to the broader culture and yada yada, right? So the thing is, today we're in a place where it's not so clear when you're coming of age and trying to find yourself in the world and answer those questions for yourself. Who am I? What am I about? What do I believe in? What is important and valuable and meaningful to me? It's not as easy for us living in America to answer that question today as it would be for somebody who was, say, living in a hunter-gatherer tribe, and they just have their indigenous religion and they're surrounded by their family all the time. And that's just kind of life. Like, you just naturally in that situation would identify with those around you and the beliefs that you all share, right? Now in America, though, you don't have that. I mean, America's truly this melting pot. What do you think about this, right? You go to, so you can't as an American identify as an ethnicity, really, or it's harder to. It's not like if you're an Italian, or Sicilian, you can identify as Sicilian, right? And there's a certain idea about what Sicilian is, like there's a type of food and culture and all this sort of stuff. Well, with America, it's like, well, what would that be, Because that's going to vary a lot depending on the group that you're in or where you live in the country, right? Living in a small town in the South or Midwest is going to be a whole lot different than living in a big city on one of the coasts, Right. So in America, it's like people have this longing for an identity, and there's a reaction that I think a lot of people have. And so this is where I'm going to come back to my own life and kind of tie this into what I see going on in the world around us today. In my own life, I was raised in a real religious household. So that was kind of the expectation. You're going to identify as being a part of this religion. And for me, it just, I felt like it didn't resonate with me. And when I looked around at other people, it felt like there's like this pressure to perform, to appear like you identify with it, right? People would say, give their testimonies, and they would put on a show emotionally. And sometimes it would mystify me sometimes to hear somebody do that, knowing their life outside of church, and like, well, is this really like, maybe it's genuine, or maybe it's like in the moment, it's like, this is a effort. The brain is great at deceiving itself, right? There's that whole thing about, what is it in, I think it's in Jeremiah. I have to look this up, but it's like the heart is desperately and deceitfully wicked above all else. Who can know it, or something like that. Basically, it's like, and here you're talking about a heart that's just apart from God, which I believe this is true. Yeah, it's going to be desperately, deceitfully wicked. You're so easy to fool yourself. Or if you want to follow the science, you can talk about Richard Feynman, the physicist, who said, and I quote, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." Right? Also, he says, and this is something that, even though I say I believe in God, I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, is I'd rather have questions I can't answer than answers I can't question. Also from Richard Feynman, which I think says it very well. I'd rather have questions I can't answer than answers I can't question. All right, so what I was saying, though, about that, I think it's, again, psychology supports this. I mean, you look at some of the work of involving, for example, split brain patients. There's a book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist about, right brain, left brain stuff, and how people, in these split brain cases where somebody has, they have seizures, so they have to basically cut the, connective tissue between the left and the right hemisphere to keep the seizures from spreading, right? And so in those cases, they can feed information, to one hemisphere but not the other by, having the person hold their eyes shut or, whatever, right? But in these cases, it's like the left brain is a good BSer. Like the left brain is great at not knowing something, not knowing the real reason for things, but then inventing a reason, right? All right. So back to what I was saying about identity. In my own upbringing, with religion, I mean, I felt like I saw that, where people would, maybe they sincerely in that moment felt some religious emotion, but it just didn't seem real beyond that moment, and I felt like there was a real pressure to kind of manufacture or find or display that type of religious emotion, even though I didn't feel it myself, right? And I kind of made me a little skeptical of it. But the thing, as I got older, right? And so I didn't, as an adolescent, I was agnostic, maybe atheist at some point, right? I didn't really have like a real belief system, but I readily went out looking for stuff to identify with, without realizing that's what I was doing. I did, trying out different identities, if you will, different, and I saw that around me in the world. Like, looking back, it seems pretty obvious now that that's what a lot of us were doing, is looking for an identity, Whether in one person's case, it may be they play guitar and they start a band, and I'm a musician. I'm a rock musician. I play guitar. I sing. That's what I do. That's what's important to me, right? That's their identity. Or or in another person's case, maybe they join a fraternity or sorority, right? They're in college. It's like, hey, I've never, been part of a close-knit group. This gives me an opportunity. I didn't do that. The Army was enough of a fraternity for me. Don't need to play make-believe at college, but a lot of people did. That's a big thing, especially if you're familiar with like black culture, the black fraternities and sororities at especially like HBCUs, that's huge, right? People that's a huge bond that people have, right? Something very powerful people identify with. This is, I'm a, AKA or a Delta or a whatever, right? Whether it's your profession, you look around and that's what people do. It's not just a matter of I'm doing this because I need money to work, or I'm doing this and I enjoy it, but it's like it consumes the entire identity, right? So there's this existential crisis in America. People try to fill it with stuff. Okay, so now you have identity politics, right? And this is problematic for a couple of reasons. Identity politics is problematic, first of all, because it's really a smokescreen that I'm convinced the elite class have jumped all over and promoted because they see it as potentially useful to them. And here's why. It's like you go back to 2007, 2008, 2009, there was that whole meltdown with the financial system because the banks and the Federal Reserve and there's just this level of corruption and greed in the financial sector that just blew up the entire economy, right? And people were pissed. These banks got bailed out. They got preferential treatment under both Bush and Obama. I mean, basically, you have a red puppet and you have a blue puppet, and the same puppet master, i.e. the financial system, the bankers, the Wall Street types, are controlling those two puppets. So it doesn't matter whether you got a red puppet, George Bush and his neocon team, or a blue puppet, Obama and his neocon team running the show. Like, the banks get what they want, right? And people were pissed. So there's Occupy Wall Street. People are coming together. This is more like a true class war type scenario. People are like, hey, there's this elite class that controls the financial system, and they have rigged the game. They screwed everybody over. They caused this financial calamity, this recession, this ordinary people lost their retirement accounts, or ordinary people lost their jobs, lost their houses, whatever. And the bankers get bailed out. They're the ones that cause it to happen, and they get bailed out. Like, nobody else gets bailed out, but they get bailed out, and then they take the money and just hold on to it and pay it to themselves and don't, share it or any of that, right? So there's this idea of like, this is bullshit, which it was, right? So you have Occupy Wall Street. Well, not surprisingly, it didn't take long after Occupy Wall Street for identity politics to get like a whole new lease on life. Like, identity politics wasn't necessarily new. I mean, you've always had that to some extent, but it really, you noticed that it was not long after Occupy Wall Street kind of died down that the new thing for the new pressure release valve was like Black Lives Matter type protest, right? Was like the anger on college campuses about speech being violence, or, I can't believe this far right winger, is giving a speech, or this professor made this joke that offended me because it was misogynistic, or could be interpreted as misogynistic, even though that's obviously not what he meant, right? Like, you have this identity politics that really exploded after that. And so I'm thinking, I don't have proof of this, but knowing how that these are some bad actors at work in the elite circles of our global economy, and if you doubt that, just look at Justin Trudeau and how he's treating the trucker convoy and the trucker protests, or look at Jeffrey Epstein and the fact that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and all their comrades sex trafficked young girls, nobody froze their bank accounts, right? Nobody froze their bank accounts. And then the list of the guests, and what went on at Jeffrey Epstein's little Pleasure Island or his Lolita Express, we still don't know those things, right? So it's like, yeah, there's some dark shit going on in the elite circles of society, right? So knowing how bad actors work and knowing that there are bad actors at the top of our society, I just see this pattern. I'm like, to me, there's probably a connection. I would be shocked if there was not. But at any rate, nowadays, whether they deliberately push identity politics to get out of the Occupy Wall Street sort of class politics, I'm not sure if it was as explicit as that, but definitely once identity politics became a thing, Black Lives Matter and Antifa, it's pretty clear that has gotten a big time push from the elite class, from the regime, right? Why? Because it's useful to them. And I mentioned this in a previous episode, a couple episodes ago. The elites want a race war, which they appear to want. Why? It allows them to divide and conquer. Keep the working people, the ordinary people, from coming together and acknowledging they have a common enemy, they have a lot of common ground, and that, so it's useful to them. But the other thing about identity politics is it's toxic on a personal level. So it's toxic on a social level because it really misdirects so much anger that may be legitimate. People realize there's something kind of wrong with the way things are, right? And all you got to do is just look at COVID and how that has been handled, and the messaging around COVID, and the way that public officials will contradict themselves to suit whatever they want to conclude that week. Highly motivated reasoning, if you can even call it reasoning. Perfect example, of course, being like, you can't gather to protest the lockdowns. You can't gather for a funeral. But if you want to gather to riot because of, George Floyd, then by all means, the virus is not going to be a problem there. But it will be a problem if you gather for a funeral, right? Stuff like that. It just makes no sense. It's absurd on its face, All right. So there's legitimate anger, and it's misdirected into these identity politics sort of pathways. Because, hey, what better way to divide the working class, right? You get a bunch of, poor, say, for example, black people thinking, well, the poor white people, that's your enemy. The working poor whites, and that's your enemy. Instead of the elite whites, as well as some elite blacks, who say go visit Jeffrey Epstein on his pedophile island, right? Who are part of the Davos group or whatever, So there's that smoke screen. But on a personal level, the identity politics is also really toxic because it is something that's easy but empty, right? As opposed to meaningful but probably hard. Meaningful, and it's going to take some work. Meaningful, and it's going to take you being honest with yourself and acknowledging your failures and striving to be and do better, right? Like that's what real, meaningful identification with something, greater than yourself requires, right? So it's like if you're, and an easy way to put this is just because probably the one that's most familiar to people is like in a religious setting, like if you go to church or synagogue or whatever, and you really strive to seek God with an open, sincere heart, I believe you'll find him, I believe that you'll have a connection with something, like if that's what you're about. And I think if I understand Jesus correctly, that's what his synopsis of the law in the Old Testament was about as well. Why he would say things like, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. Like that there's this, you can take anything, however good, and you can misuse it. You can warp it, especially if you capture the institutions or the judges or whatever, right? Like you can take the best law and pervert the hell out of it, and especially if you have the judges on your side, it's like you can easily do that, right? So it's like if you're just following the letter of the law, all you got to do is spend any time around lawyers to see or read, about some of these legal cases to see, you can, the letter of the law is sometimes an excuse to do bad things or an excuse to unfairly target somebody. You really don't like Joe Rogan, and this isn't in a legal context, but this is how this works a lot of times. You really don't like Joe Rogan because he's got this big platform, bigger than yours at CNN or MSNBC or whatever, and he's not listening to you. He's not taking orders from you and just reporting the things that you want him to say. And so you target him for, misinformation because of COVID, and that doesn't work. Oh, he's a racist, and that doesn't work, So back to what I was saying about in a religious setting, if you go with that in mind, and I think that's the thing where God, or a belief in God, is very conducive to this, because it's easy to lie to yourself, but when you know you're accountable to somebody else, it's not impossible, but it is enough motivation to ask yourself the tough questions and not just take the easy answer, but to really work with it, to really look at your life. And this is one of the things where, say what you want about Christian, and I'll just use that because this is what I have more familiarity with, but there's a lot of people that don't will label Christianity or Christians as being fake or hypocritical, because that's kind of the stereotype. And there are many, just like there are in any group of people. But when it's real, it's meaningful. And if you are in a situation, few people, I'll just say it like this. Few people have the motivation, because it's not a pleasant thing to do. Few people have the motivation just on their own to uncover and deal with the dark, painful shit about themselves, where they fucked up, or where they've been a bad person, where they've done bad things or whatever, right? Few people, most people don't want to deal with that, because it's not pleasant, right? But in Christianity, you have a perfect balance of, one, an incentive to do it, to say, well, God's going to help me in this process, and God loves me enough to walk with me through this process so I can do it, So there's this incentive, this empowerment to do it in the first place. There's also an accountability aspect of it, right? If you, and this is the idea of, say, having a quiet time, you pray, you read the Bible or whatever you do, and you, during that time, you look at your life and say, it doesn't add up to what if I'm honest with myself, what God wants me to be, what God wants me to do, my life as it is doesn't add up to that, right? But it gives you the empowerment and grace that you need to say, but I'm going to do better with God's help, because God loves me, and it's progress, not perfection. So recovery groups, and I'm just used a slogan from recovery groups, also, kind of quasi-Christian. There's a lot of stuff that's based on the Bible or based on Christian, traditionally understood Christian principles. But again, with recovery, it's the same thing. It's this emphasis on, and with Christianity too, acknowledging sin, and that term has this connotation that, so I want to be precise with it. When I say sin, it's you've fallen short of the mark of where you believe in your heart, this is what God wants from my life. God created me to be good and to do good, and I'm living and acting in a way that's much less than that, right? In the same way that you would say with a child who, they're capable of, kindness, and instead that's they're, instead of sharing, or well, let's just say instead of, you got a chocolate bar, you got 2 kids, and you say, all right, here, divide this equally between the 2 of you, right? And one of your kids is tries to, while the other one is not looking, steal a much larger piece, right? So you're in that situation, you're okay, well, what you did is wrong. You weren't supposed to do it. You're capable of being a better person than the type of person who's just cheating and trying to lie and steal to get ahead, right? So in that case, you would say, you sinned, But again, there's this combination of an acknowledgement of sin, or acknowledgement of shortcoming, wrongdoing, whatever, and then the grace to have compassion both on yourself so that you can do better and be empowered to try to do better, and compassion on others to forgive them where they fuck up, And not hold it over their head and acknowledge that, man, people can change. Everybody makes mistakes. People can change. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean just be a doormat. If somebody's routinely, screwing you over and they're not a trustworthy person, well, don't believe their promises, right? They've shown that they can't be trusted. Don't take their promises. Know what you're getting into when you deal with people, right? So it's kind of a complicated thing, but anyway, that's what I feel like. And same thing, you could say this about therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, you kind of have with cognitive behavioral therapy this idea of like, this is what my life could be, this is where my life is, but you have compassion on yourself. You identify ways in which your automatic thoughts are harmful to yourself. So you challenge those thoughts. You do new things, to say, okay, I'm scared of this. I get really anxious when this happens. So I'm going to expose myself to that so that I can kind of overcome this fear, right? There's this program for improving your life. So I would say with like that type of therapy, that type of spirituality, that type of religious practice, like that's something that's meaningful but hard. Like it's hard work, and ultimately it's worth it. And everybody who goes through it nobody ever arrives at a state of perfection, but everybody who goes through that and sticks with it for any length of time ultimately concludes, I'm glad I put in that work, And it's one of those things too. I know in my own life, it's being for myself. I mean, so I've had a spiritual journey that, after being agnostic, then I was like, all right, I gotta, seek God because life was tough, had some stuff happen. So I was like, all right. I first started going to, Catholic church, and later on Protestant. Then later on, I was like, went through some more stuff in my belief system. I was like, the thing that I initially was attracted to in this, which is just this kind of idea of grace and compassion and forgiveness and mercy and doing better, that really is like embodied in recovery programs and the spirit of that. Like that thing that drew me to Christianity seemed to be something that was no longer present in my spiritual walk, in my, experience of Christianity, going to church, right? It was more about, gets to a point where you're performing a role, keeping up a public image or whatever, and not allowed to ask or entertain certain questions. I'm like, no, fuck that. If this shit ain't working, if I know I don't have the answers, the worst thing for me to do is try to pretend that I do, and just deny the doubt and pretend like everything is okay when it's not. But so I kind of went through some stuff where I was like, all right, maybe I need to just put everything on the line and to get into like the specifics, in terms of theology, philosophy, and all that. The historical criticism of the Bible, things like that. So I went through this period where I was like, all right, maybe there isn't anything. But I've come back around recently to this idea of like, there's something about with the story of Jesus. There's something powerful about that, And so at this point, I'm not going to declare that I know 1,000% that historically everything that's recorded in the New Testament happened the way it's described. I don't know. Also, how did God create human beings? What's the exact relationship of God to this world? I don't know. But I'm confident that the ultimate reality, there's a spiritual dimension to our being and to the world around us that is somehow greater and ultimately more real than what we see around us. And something that actually helped kind of change my perspective on this was the idea of a simulation, which if you're familiar with recently it's become a thing. Like Nick Bostrom, the philosopher, proposed it, and and now it's kind of in the culture, there's this idea of like the Matrix, a simulation. Like, is it possible for there to be a computer simulation in which it's so real that you don't even realize you're in a computer simulation, right? I guess is what they're aiming to do with the metaverse, right? But I thought about that. I was like, well, you know what? That's something interesting to think about when it comes to like the idea of God and this, because that's basically what religions have been saying for a long time. Now, maybe not in the language of a computer, but in the language of there's this reality that is more real, but from within this physical world, we don't see it, touch it, taste it, or any of that, right? And hold on, I got a child that just entered the room. And I'm back. All right, so if I can get back my train of thought, Lord knows I got enough problems with my ADD or ADHD or whatever it is, paying attention and focusing. So let's get back on track here. Sorry for this. Here's what I encountered with that was like thinking about the simulation hypothesis, right? The Matrix, right? In a way, that's kind of what, the spiritual teachers of the past kind of told us this was. Is like, this is not really the ultimate real base level reality. This is kind of, they didn't use the term simulation, but kind of like, here we are, we're these conscious beings in this space, three-dimensional space, and there's more to reality than what we're able to perceive physically, right? That's just kind of been the message for a long time. Well, I'm thinking about this, I'm like, man, this is really interesting with simulation theory, because how many simulations could you run on the same hard drive? Like, if it's an advanced enough computer, right? How many simulations could you run on the same hard drive? So would it be so hard necessarily to believe, like if I can believe in a computer being created by some member of an advanced race, is it so impossible to think of God creating something like that, that our brains or our consciousness renders as an experience of this world? I don't know. That's, you get out in the weeds pretty quickly. And in this respect, I don't buy into Gnosticism completely, but there's some insights from Gnosticism I think are interesting that I can't just discount as being obviously false because they were labeled heretics by some of the early church fathers. But anyway, back to what I was saying though about this is like, okay, you have with religion, spiritual practices, recovery groups, some forms of therapy, and possibly from what I gather, like microdosing as a therapy. That's something that's actually been useful to me. I've not microdosed lately. I did when I was younger, macrodosed, but I haven't microdosed, hallucinogens lately, right? I understand. I imagine it's probably a great thing from what I've read of and heard of other people's experiences with like, microdosing psilocybin and going through therapy or whatever, right? Or MDMA therapy, whatnot. But I have used marijuana and the legal stuff. I'll just say that for, liability purposes. In my state, it's legal to use Delta 8 hemp derived, right? It's, you need an electron microscope to tell it apart from the real thing. It's not as powerful if you smoke it, but if you ingest it as an edible, your body metabolizes it the same way. So I've enjoyed using that in conjunction with meditation. Like I used Sam Harris's Waking Up meditation app. Really helpful. I would say it was extremely helpful. I've been working on this meditation practice and now coming back to the Bible and a different kind of take on that. And anyway, just say all that to say, like, I know from firsthand experience, having an empty sense of identity, like not really having something solid, tangible that you can grab hold of, that's a, really difficult thing or challenging thing, I mean, Nietzsche, who was a guy who said God is dead, Nietzsche also said, he who has a why can bear with almost anyhow. He who has a why can bear with almost anyhow. Like if you have a reason, if you have some meaningful reason for doing what you're doing, you can put up with a lot of pain and suffering in the process, right? I mean, that's the whole point of like, if you're doing PT and you're in the military, let's just say you do PT, it may suck in the moment, but you're like, I'm training for this reason that is ultimately meaningful. I'm getting in shape. I'm getting ready for whatever missions I may be assigned, whatnot, right? Like there's this, but if you were just doing it as like torture, which of course if you're in the military and basic training, they kind of combine things. A lot of times they do stuff as punishment when it's really just to get you in shape, so they'll smoke you for every little thing, they'll invent stuff sometimes, put you in these no-win situations so they can smoke the entire platoon or whatever, right? It's like, and when you're doing it, when it's punishment, it's a trick. You got to reframe it as like, I'm doing this to get in shape, even though the drill sergeant's standing over me yelling, down, up, or whatever, or front leaning, rest position, move, so yeah, you hear that a lot when you're in the Army, especially the lower enlisted. But yeah, if you reframe it as like, I'm doing, okay, yeah, I'm getting punished right now, but I'm getting stronger, so it's good, right? I'm doing this for myself. It makes it a lot better. You have a why, you can deal with the how, right? But I would say the corollary or converse of that, he who has no why finds almost any how unbearable. I think that's true. If you have no why, like if you're like really look at the world and like, I don't see how my being alive has any value to anybody whatsoever, like it just doesn't seem meaningful at all, then any little thing is going to be enough to make you feel like I can't do this, or what's the point? I don't even want to do it. Like, that's too much. Like, and so people need an identity. They need a why, right? Well, that's when identity politics comes in. It gives people that, right? And this comes, you can, in part, like Eric Hoffer in his book about the true believer, the psychology of mass movements, he talks about this, that a lot of times what people are looking for in these mass movements is an identity, right? They look at themselves, they look at their place in the world, they don't see it going anywhere that they can identify with as being good. And so they identify with this mass movement because maybe this could work out for me. If I just keep doing what I'm doing, going to my job, living a normal life, being a good citizen or whatever, like my life feels empty, I have no why. But if I join this movement, it promises that I can be on the right side of history. That belief, whether it's true or not, if the person subjectively believes that they're fighting this noble cause that's going to put them on the right side of history, that's a powerful incentive, right? But it's ultimately kind of an empty one a lot of times. I mean, for every really noble movement that really identifies a real evil and really puts forward valid, legitimate solutions, and not just valid, legitimate solutions, but also makes its followers and adherents better people. That's another trick, because a lot of movements don't do that at all. So if you're part of a movement and the movement itself is like cares about making its adherents and followers better people, have more happy, wholesome, virtuous, effective, meaningful lives, to maximize their human flourishing, right? That's a good thing. Even if the aims of the movement are not met, as long as the aims are legitimate and it's improving the lives of its people, that's a good thing. But most movements don't do that. Most movements, and you look at it with identity politics. So I talked about the dynamic earlier with Christianity. This is what I'm most familiar with. But again, this idea, and you find it to some extent in recovery, and some extent in some forms of therapy. With Buddhism and Taoism, it's interesting. I think there's some real insights there. It's a little different. I don't think, personally, based on my experience, like I felt like Taoism / Buddhism, Zen, really, by itself was enough. But it had some useful insights that, combined with other perspectives, helped me to see things about myself and my own values and my own vision for what my life can be and who I can be as a person. That were really helpful. I mean, one of the things is, of course, with Buddhism is good, is like you're being honest with yourself about what you're experiencing, what you're feeling or whatever, but not identifying with that experience or that feeling. Like, I acknowledge, because this is one of the problems that I had or started to have with church, particularly the church that I was going to, and the culture was kind of like, and this may have just been my take on it, based on kind of what I was going through in my life at the time, but this idea that, you don't want to present an image of somebody who doesn't really believe this stuff. And if you really believe this stuff, then you're going to have certain outcomes. And so you got to kind of act like you have those outcomes, even if you don't. And that's not something that's consciously preached, but there is this real social pressure to kind of conform to whatever the image is. And some of this is in the Bible, where Paul talks about like the qualifications for a bishop or leader in the church, right? Oh, he should have all these virtuous things. And it makes sense. But then the problem is are you still free to be able to say, hey, you know what? I'm really struggling with this right here. Like, this isn't so easy or whatnot, right? Or it's too easy to just say, yeah, I don't want to do that because, what's important is what people see. People can get in that. That's how you wind up with people that get in these scandals, like whether it's, pastors like back in the 80s, I guess it was Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker, or the Catholic priests who, abused children, and then the bishops that moved them around and covered it up, right? Like, that's how you wind up with a situation like that, where you have somebody who's ostensibly preaching the good news, but really what they're doing is acting just like any, person at some shady, sleazy business, covering up wrongdoings and misdeeds, right? But I think it's important that, that's one of the things with Buddhism is like, acknowledge what you feel and what you experience, but don't identify with it. Like, that's not you. Yeah, that's an important, realization to make. But I think combined with something from Christianity, at least the spirit of it, like that God is ultimately good and God ultimately loves and cares enough for you to forgive you, have mercy on you, be with you as you walk through that process and empower you to be better and to do better, to be an instrument of good in his hands, right? And I think if that's how you live and that's how you approach your religion or your philosophy, it can be a great thing, but that's not what we see from the woke. That's not what we see from people in these political movements, where it's all about, for example, identity politics right now, right? There's certain identities. If you have a good identity, like the more intersectional or oppressed you are, the better you are, right? You're black. Oh, well, of course, your people were enslaved, and there's Jim Crow, there's all this racism, Black Lives Matter, right? You're black. You're great, unless you dare to be conservative, in which case you'll get labeled a white supremacist somehow, which is a weird thing to hear. Like somebody like Winsome Sears, right? I think she was born in Jamaica, but she moved to the United States, served in the Marine Corps, just physically, it's not like she's like light skinned with, it's not like she's like, 1/4 black, 3/4 white, and so she could pass for white. It's like, no, she looks African, in her features, right? And yet she's labeled a white supremacist because she doesn't follow the talking points of the woke left. Like, that's just kind of crazy. But again, not a lot of logical consistency there. Why is it so attractive? Again, not because it's logical, not because it's effective, but because it gives people this identity, right? So if you're black and your life sucks, here you go. Latch on to identity politics. You're right to feel pissed off. You're right to feel aggrieved. You're right to feel that life is shit and it's unfair. And this is a group of people that will be with you as you bitch and moan and complain about it and get even violent and riot over it, right? Same thing if you're whatever other ethnicity you are, right? Or if you're white, well, you're a bad person by virtue of the fact that you're white, unless you can become trans or gay or whatever, right? You come out of the closet, and I'm not saying this to knock people who really are gay or really have gender dysphoria. I don't understand that. That's not been, anything that's remotely comparable to my experience. So I don't want to judge the person. It's not my place. That's between them and God, and however they live, I don't have to answer to God for them. That's between them and God. So personally, you can't tell me that biologically that having a man and a woman form a family as a husband and wife and raising their children as mother and father, that you can't tell me that is biologically or in any other way completely the same as two men or two women or trans men or trans women or whatever, right? No way. Like, there's just too much settled science, if you want to follow science, about the differences between genders in terms of emotional, cognitive, right? Personality, whatever, right? The biological roles of mother, father are real. The biological categories of male and female are real. You can tinker with that, but it doesn't make it the same, And so my whole thing with the gay rights or LGBTQ trans rights movement is, look, it's a free country. I'm perfectly content to live and let live. You do you. I'm not saying who you should live with, who you should have sex with, what you should identify as, or how you should present yourself to the world. But if your demand is that I agree with you 100% that everything you do and say and stand for is the exact same and just as good as anything else, that's nonsense. Like, if your idea as a gay man or lesbian woman is, hey, don't make it illegal for me to be with my girlfriend or to be with my lover or partner, whatever, right? Sure. I don't think that anybody should. The government has any business telling people what to do and not do in the bedroom. As long as you're protecting the rights of like minors and incapacitated persons, like obviously, yeah, you can't have a 6-year-old or a or somebody who's an adult but who's mentally retarded and has the mind of a 6-year-old, right? Yeah, okay, you have to protect vulnerable people, but when you're talking about adults, no, whatever you want to do, but don't demand that I celebrate it, right? Like, live and let live. I don't have to like everything that you like. You don't have to like everything that I like. Like, I may think that hockey is fucking awesome, right? And I just love watching the fights. The hockey is all right, but I love it for the fights, And you may think, man, why are you wasting your time watching that hockey shit, If you want to see some fights, just watch the UFC. That's stupid, right? We can both have our opinions and beliefs, and it doesn't fucking matter at the end of the day, right? Right? Like, you shouldn't, I'm not going to look at you as like, well, you're a bad person because, you disagree with me. You don't value hockey as highly as I do. For the record, I don't value hockey. I mean, I like it if I get a chance to go to a game, but I'm living in the American South. There's not a lot of ice around here. I don't even know how to ice skate, so yeah, whatever. But my point is this. It's like, that's my issue. And I think probably a lot of people are issue with the gay rights, LGBTQ, trans rights, all that stuff is not that they want to do what they want to do and not get arrested or harassed for it, but that they want to do what they want to do, but then they want the rest of us to agree with them that their way is the best, or at least that their way is just as good in every possible way as our way of doing things. And it's like, that's just not even, one, it's not even true, but two, why would you demand that I endorse your lifestyle? Like, just live your lifestyle. Why do you need me to endorse it? I'm not asking you to endorse my lifestyle. I'm not coming to you and saying, hey, profess a statement of faith that heterosexual marriage is the best, And if you don't, you're a bad person and a bigot. You're a heterophobe and I'm going to cancel you. But that's what gay people do. Not all, but that's what some do with, like, what you personally don't think that gay marriage is as good as heterosexual marriage from a biological standpoint, from a parenting children standpoint. You're concerned that having two fathers is not the same as having a mother and a father. You're a bad person. Again, I'm not, whatever. All right, that's a whole rabbit hole I can go down another time. But I just say that I think the whole, maybe not for gay people, but for trans, I suspect, and the more stuff that I've read recently from people who have come out of that movement, who especially, there's a trend now among white adolescent girls to identify as trans. And then many of them, after the fact, are like, what the fuck did I get myself into? This isn't really who I am, And I suspect a lot of that comes from this identity, need for an identity. It gives you an identity that under the woke worldview, all right, now I'm oppressed. Now I'm marginalized. Now I'm intersectional. I can be a good person again. I can have an opinion. I can voice it without feeling I'm ashamed because I'm this white privileged person who doesn't know what it's like to suffer or deal with adversity, which is patent bullshit, patently absurd. But that's kind of the view, right? So it's like if you are a if you identify as trans, well, now you got this powerful identity, you're a victim. And now you have this fight against oppression. You're on the right side of history. You're fighting oppression, right? And you got this whole community around you of people that validate you for doing that. That is the driving force of it. So anyway, the fact that it's illogical in many ways. Some of the claims. For example, like there's lots of people have pointed this out. The real tension between, say, the trans movement and the feminist movement, right? Where the feminists, especially, during the 70s and 80s, the more old school feminists, right? Their argument was like, your particular clothing doesn't define you as a woman, or certain occupations don't define you as a woman. Like, you being a woman doesn't mean that you have to be a nurse or a teacher or whatever, or that you, and again, whether you agree or disagree that there's real biological differences between men and women, I think that science is pretty clear on that. For the party that says, follow the science, they sure don't like to follow science when it comes to issues of gender. But there's real differences with the preferences that men and women have, what types of fields men and women want to go into, and so forth, right? But there's this real tension there between what the feminists will say with, being a woman doesn't mean wearing a dress and high heels and lipstick and all that, right? Like, that's one type of behavior that women may engage in, but that's not what being a woman means, right? Being a woman means you have two X chromosomes, you have a vagina, you have, right? And normalizing the fact that, like, half the population or over half the population, menstruates, or, potentially gets pregnant and bears children, right? So it's like old school feminists, the idea was, that those type of things that are essentially feminine should not be stigmatized. And similarly, those things that aren't essentially feminine should not be used to limit who women can be in the world, right? But then the trans people come along and they're like, oh, you know what? I'm a woman because I like to wear high heels and lipstick, and I like to, I don't know, like go do girly things, right? Whatever that is. And so it's like an opposite message, completely the opposite, in fact, from what the traditional feminist said. So, there's a lot of logical inconsistency there. But I think the thing, why that logical inconsistency, or really illogic, exists and is so prevalent in these movements on the left with identity politics, this wokeism and all that, and also why appeals to logic and reason don't seem to have a lot of effect, right? Like, there's a statement, I think it was Bertrand Russell that said this. I'm probably getting it wrong. But that basically you can't reason somebody out of a position that they were never reasoned into in the first place, right? And I think that's really true. And you see this with some of the people on the woke left. It's like, you can present like, well, if you really believe this, here's some of what is actually going on in the world, and challenge them with facts and data and evidence and all that in there. Usually their response is to double down on whatever they already believe and dismiss and to turn to the logical fallacies of, like, character assassination. Oh, you're a bad person for bringing this up. Ad hominem attacks, red herrings, straw men, whatever. Like, they run the whole gamut. But rarely do you encounter somebody, a wokist, who really deals honestly with criticism or with their critics. Usually there's, this sort of sophist type approach to it, right? So anyway, again, I think the thing is, identity is the driving force there. People identify with these movements because it fills that void in their life. I got a community of people who share my values. They validate me for believing this, for saying these things. And a lot of times, not even what you do. Like, you don't have to really do anything. Unless you're trans, and then you can, present however you present. And, again, I'm not, there are people that really do have gender dysphoria. That's a different issue. But there's kind of a trend right now, particularly among adolescent girls, to identify as trans, that seems out of proportion to the real rates of gender dysphoria, right? So what's the answer? And this is where I would say, like, the answer is an identity based on something that is meaningful, but probably hard. And to do that, it takes really like a better story. The thing with like wokeism is it kind of captures a story where the world is this, you got oppressors and oppressed. You got good guys and bad guys. And we're on the side of the good people who are fighting against the bad people who've been in power the whole time the world has been in existence. But we're fighting them, and we're going to bring about a future where everybody can, be happy. It's really overly simplistic and one-dimensional. It's not a deep philosophy at all, and there's a lot of problems with it. But it provides that, right? For people who don't have a religion, for people who don't have any spiritual practice or real depth to them, this gives them something that they can latch onto and say, this is who I am. This is what I identify with. These are my people, the people that share this belief. And it's a powerful, powerful thing, right? To combat that, and this really may be even something where you talk about people who are young, particularly children, giving them this, because somebody really in the throes of this madness, because that's what it is, and it's a form of insanity, with wokeism. It's almost like it has to burn itself out. They have to get smacked on the ass a few times by life, which life will do. It's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to everybody out there over the age of 15 or 10 or whatever, right? Like, you get out in the world, life will put you on your ass a few times. Like, kick your fucking ass. You think, just because you think the world is this way, if the world is not really that way, you'll find out. Usually the hard way. Unless you're one of those people who's like so rich and privileged that you don't have to deal with consequences, which, coincidentally enough, that also overlaps nicely with a lot of the people who are the most woke, are some of the most privileged people, right? The people that go to like these Ivy League institutions or these elite liberal arts colleges, they don't, anyway. Right, you're privileged. If you go to Harvard, for undergrad, and Yale for your, whatever, your JD or your PhD or whatever, you're freaking privileged, right? But those are some of the wokest people, and it makes sense, right? If you're rich enough, if you're from the upper crust, right, it's easier to kind of use your money to paper over the real life effects of your thing. That's why with, San Francisco or LA, or you see the homeless problem there, right? Well, the homeless aren't living in the really ritzy, gated communities, that have private security and all that. It's the ordinary working people that are most affected by that. Like, if you're rich enough, you don't have to deal with, even though your agenda was what brought this about in large part, you don't have to deal with it because you're rich enough. You can hide it from yourself, right? But again, like, if you're an adult, you pretty much have to get kicked in the ass enough times to kind of realize, oh shit, this isn't actually what I believe. But I think for children, and so if you're a parent, this is important, giving your kids a real story that is meaningful, that is good. And I think, I haven't come across a better one than the basic essence of the Christian story. And you can, if you're not comfortable with church, maybe use it more in the way that recovery groups have used it, because they've basically co-opted, a lot of these 12-step programs. AA being the most famous, but they basically, a lot of the stuff with the big book, if you're familiar with it, is like, it's drawn from the Bible. Some of it's drawn from other things too, but there's a large part of it is drawn from the Bible. All these recovery groups, at the end of every meeting, everybody gathers together, holds hands, and says the Lord's Prayer, right? Every recovery meeting you go to, no matter what the recovery in question is, whatever it is that the group of people is recovering from, they say the Lord's Prayer, right? So, but in doing that, you can't do it in the real super Pharisaic religious way. And here, this is like 100% in line with Jesus, because whatever else you think or don't think about Jesus, who did he have the most problems with? Who were his enemies? Who were the people, the cancel culture mob of his day, who were trying to shut him down, shut him up, put him to death, whatever? The religious people, the ultra religious people, the people that identified not with their relationship with God, but their status in this dominance hierarchy that was based on religion, right? Like, you're a Pharisee, that's a big freaking deal, in that society, right? You're a Sadducee, that's a really big freaking deal. right? So if you're a Sadducee and here comes Jesus, preaching this message that kind of may threaten, the stability of the social order in which you are at the top of this dominance hierarchy, you're going to fight like hell to keep him from disturbing the social order because you like it the way that it is. You're on top of this dominance hierarchy, right? So again, I think this is consistent with the Christian message to say, don't be a Pharisee, right? Like, acknowledge what you know and what you don't know. Don't pretend to know more than you do. Don't, and so here's an example of this, right? For a long time, with my own personal, after I kind of went through my phase as an agnostic or atheist in, my teens and 20s, I came around to like this belief in God, really kind of through the back door of these recovery groups and kind of this new concept of God. It's like, oh wow, this is a different paradigm shift for me, to look at God in this way as a healer, right? And some of those parables where Jesus is a healer or the good shepherd really resonated with me at that point. But I also had some experiences where I felt like I couldn't make sense of those if there's no God. Like it just where a couple of things happened that really were almost like miraculous, and I'm not overusing that term. I mean, like one, I can think of exactly where the thought was impressed on my mind that somebody was going to run a red light through an intersection as I'm approaching the intersection. And it totally caught me off guard. It had not had something like that. This doesn't happen often at all. But as I was approaching the intersection, I was like, so I started to slow down, almost more out of curiosity, like, what is this all about? But sure as shit, somebody flew through the intersection like fast as hell. I don't know what they were doing. This was like a late night. They may have been drunk off their ass or whatever. I don't know. But bottom line was like, I know I don't have it in me to predict the future like that, to predict who's going to run a traffic light and who's not, right? Now, at the end of the day, I kind of took that as validation of the existence of God or some kind of spiritual realm. And I was like, the only thing that at that point in my life that I really had that to make sense of that was like the Christian kind of theology. Now, I recognize that as I was going through my life more recently, after some things, and it's like, there's this part of the Bible it talks about, and I believe this is in the book of Hebrews, where it talks about things being shaken once more, so it will be the removal of all the things that can't be shaken. And it's like, you go through that in life enough times, it's good, but it's not fun to go through. And so anyway, as I was going through that again, this time as an adult, after, having been going to church for a while, I'm like, well, what do I make of some of these experiences that I had? And the thing that I realized was like, well, the experience by itself doesn't prove Christian theology. It's possible that there is a God and he's maybe different than what, and I'm not saying that at this point I have kind of come back to a new respect for and admiration of, and maybe even belief in Christian message, Christian story. But when I was looking at this, I was like, well, okay, this particular belief or this experience, right? Like, I know that this thought was impressed upon me as I came to this intersection, and that what happened afterward was something that I would not have predicted, right? I can't just take credit. The way it happened, it's like, that's something above and beyond just the ordinary flow of events. Now, it's consistent with, if this is a simulation, right? If we were already in the metaverse or the Matrix, and it's consistent with that, or it's consistent with like other conceptions of God or whatever, right? But the reason I bring that up is just to say, like, if you're dealing with children, I think you have to be honest about what you don't know and why you believe what you believe. And in some cases, the norm for us human beings is, you want to believe something, you go out and find reasons to believe it. You justify your belief. Like, reason seems to work, whether David Hume says reason is a slave of the passions and can pretend to know their office, or you say reason really works the way rationalization, like post hoc reasoning almost. Like, you do something, now you want to rationalize why it's a good idea for you to do what you either did or what you want to do. And that's the tendency. Confirmation bias is a very real thing, right? But that's where it's like, I think, again, totally in line with the Bible, with God, with Jesus, to stop and say, okay, I don't need to pretend to have the answers 100%. Like, I can more trust God as a person, as a friend or father, where I don't know the whys and wherefores and how everything works. And I don't need to know. God's got that under control. Right? I think that's a huge thing. But certainly when you're talking to kids, raising kids, and it's just something that I'm working through in my own life with my own children, is like being honest with those struggles and with them about that, like not pretending I've arrived, I got it all. That's the Pharisees, right? I've got this worked out. Just be like me, and you'll be a-okay too. But to acknowledge, like, there's a lot of things that I don't know. I know very little, but what I do know, and I think this is where that story in the Gospel of John is so powerful about the blind man Jesus heals, and then the Pharisees and Sadducees are questioning him afterwards. Like, how could this guy heal you? Like, he doesn't even, what's his pedigree? What's his qualifications? Like, this is, but the guy then says, you know what? I don't know. I don't know the answer to your questions. All I know is I was blind and now I see. That's all I know. And there's something powerful about that, where you just stick to what it is that you know, what it is you've experienced, and don't pretend to know more than that. Don't pretend to be more than that. But also know and trust that you have a God that loves you, that cares for you, that forgives you freely, has mercy on you, wants you to forgive others as you've been forgiven, and wants you to grow and be better, do better. And that's the Christian message in the nutshell. And it's very powerful. And I think that's why the culture wars, right? In some ways they're a real distraction. In other ways there's some importance to it, I mean, so it's a tough thing to navigate, especially if you're a normal person living a normal life. You got a job that you work, you got to pay bills, you got kids that you're trying to raise. Maybe you're even involved in their life as like a, little league coach or something like that. Like, you don't have time for all this shit on social media about all the craziness that people want to fight over. But some of it's important, right? Because if you got your school kids and you have this hardcore fundamentalist group of wokeists who want to teach your kids that, you were just arbitrarily assigned this gender at birth. But reality is, you're better as a person. You have a better identity if you denounce your biological gender and embrace this whole new gender, right? Like, you don't want an impressionable kid learning about that shit at school, right? That's not the school's job. The school doesn't need to be teaching that, doesn't need to be involved with that. Like, if that's what schools are about, we need to shut the schools down and start over, all right? Really the only reason why public schools existed in the first place is largely something that they've kind of gotten away from, which is, hey, if we're going to have a representative democracy and people are going to be voting and they need to be citizens, then they need to be educated in things like how to read and write, how to understand an argument, how to, be aware of what's going on in the world and what their elected officials are doing or saying. You know what I mean? Like, that was the real motivation. Now it's become like this. How do kids get a job? And not to say that schools shouldn't train children to be, I don't know, skilled in the workforce. Maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. But if they're not teaching kids how to be responsible citizens, then they're failing, and there's no reason for the public to support these institutions, right? Especially if they're teaching shit like this, critical race theory and, the transgenderism and all this sort of crap, So, but all right. So that's important. Even though there's this culture war that's a largely distraction, it's like, if you find out that that this shit is going on in your kid's school, you gotta speak up. You gotta get other parents involved and put a stop to it, because it's like, that's horrible, right? I mean, it'd be just as horrible if you found out that there's like a group of hardcore Islamic jihadist believing teachers at your child's school, and they're teaching your children to hate America and to want to wage jihad against the West and fly airplanes into buildings, right? Like, you would look at that and say, what the fuck? You need to get these teachers out of here. Like, they don't need to be anywhere near my child, right? All right. So there's that. It's a difficult thing. This is, again, where I guess, point to a spiritual practice and relationship with God and say, let that guide you. how you spend your days. And you're not always going to get it right, but you can know you're forgiven when you come back to God, and know that He'll help you to do better in the future. But certainly when it comes to your children, and I say this as a parent dealing with my own children, identity is so fundamental that if you don't use your time as a parent to give them a solid, or coach them, you can't give it to them. You really, it's like, here I'm going to use Socrates' example as a midwife, where he that was an analogy he gave for himself. He said his thing, he realized he didn't know anything, and so when he was told that he was so wise, he was like, well, that can't be true. So he went about trying to find people who knew more than he did, people who said that they knew how to live a good life and be virtuous, and find out what they knew. And then in questioning them, that always he'd realize, oh, these people don't know what the hell they're talking about. They just wind up contradicting themselves, right? But he said he likened himself to a midwife, where he's getting people to almost like give birth to their own, it's going to sound bad, but there's not really a good way to express it, to give birth to their own understanding of truth, or their own wisdom, or their own, experience of the divine realm, or whatever, right? Socrates was a spiritual, philosopher, by the way. I mean, he talks about that too, like having, they use the term daimon, but almost like a guardian angel, where he would say, it would put a check in his spirit if he felt like he was about to say or do something that he shouldn't say or do. It would put a check in his spirit. And as long as he didn't feel that, he felt like, all right, I'm okay to go ahead and keep talking. But anyway, to use that phrase, a midwife, with your children, to help them to give birth to their own wisdom, self-understanding, and all that, and have an identity. And I think, again, I don't want to shit on people's religious traditions. Some that I'm familiar with are less healthy than others, and particularly religious traditions that emphasize a lot of performance, works, doing. Again, it's a balancing act, because you can't go to the other extreme either and say, well, it doesn't matter what you do or how you live your life. Well, that's not true either. Like, I think the Christian message here, as I understand some of the things that the Apostle Paul wrote, really resonate with me, that you don't judge. It's not about your actions, but your actions are a reflection of your inner life, right? So if you're a bad person, bad things are going to flow from you. Like Jesus said, by their fruits you will know them, right? So it's like, if you have these bad fruits in your life, like you're producing a bunch of bad shit, toxic relationships and other things, well, something's going on with you, right? That's a sign. And it's not to say the focus needs to be on how do I do better actions. Ultimately, the focus is how do I be a better person? And you measure that by what kind of actions, what kind of fruit am I producing, right? So in this sense, approaching that first in your own life, not to be like beating yourself up over, I'm not living up to the standard, I gotta try harder. Like, that's just a recipe to be a Pharisee, to be judgmental, to be hypocritical, to be joyless, but instead to say, you know what, life is sure tough and confusing, but God's helping me through this. I believe God is, and that He is good, and that He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. And I believe that there's this passage in the Bible, whatever else may or may not be true about the Bible, historically, whether certain events happened or didn't happen as they were described, right? There's certain things that I read and I'm like, no, this is true in some deep way. And so one of the things is in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, there's a thing that Paul says where he says, for we know that God causes all things to work together for good for them that love Him and are called according to His purpose. And it's like, whatever else I believe or don't believe about God, I believe that has to be like the starting point. Like that in a nutshell, I did not say that that's the only verse in the Bible you need, or the only spiritual insight, that's worth having. But I'm just like, that sort of premise, like to begin your prayers or your, self-examination or examination of conscience, as maybe some Catholic leaders would use the phrase, or therapy if you're into CBT, right? Like, to start with the premise, God loves me and wants me to live an abundant life, or as Jesus said, like, the devil comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy, but he's come that you might have life and have it more abundantly, right? So that right there, this abundant life, like, if what you're doing and how you're living is leading to an abundance of life, or in the words of the utilitarians, to maximizing your human flourishing and the flourishing of those, that are around you, right? If what you're doing does that, then it's good. And if what you're doing does the opposite of that, it's bad. And it's like, of course, sometimes it's not so clear cut, but I think that's a pretty good way to start. Anyway, I get into, I guess maybe I will at some point, the whys, the wherefores of how to live this out. Because I'm still working on it myself, It's not like I'm definitely a work in progress and all that. But as I look at this, I'm like, how do I, with my own children, help them or equip them to deal with what they face in the world? I'm glad I live in a red state. I'll just say that. Where I don't believe there's a lot around here in the way of critical race theory or things like that. Because again, I come back to that, and it's like, it's not to say that, to deny that racism exists, or to deny the role of racism or, discrimination in American history, because it certainly has existed. It should be acknowledged. Teach all of American history, the warts and all, but make sure you also teach the good, the very real good that America has done, the very real good that came from, say, the founders, right? Maybe they had a lot of flaws in their personal life, but they came up with some pretty ingenious insights as they were designing this system, this representative democracy that has done remarkably well, given everything, right? All right, so to tie this all together, I just say that's the power of identity is so fundamental, you can't overstate it. Like, and if people don't have an identity, they will find one, and it may not be a good one. And here's another thing I learned from experience the hard way. If you don't have a solid identity, there are no shortage of people with an agenda that is usually not in your best interest. There's no shortage of con artists and, liars and cheats who will try to give you one, try to convince you of one, right? And that's basically what a lot of these grifters, whether Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo or, some of the people with the trans movement. I mean, these people who develop this mass movement based upon some ethnic identity or this, this victimology or whatever. That's what they're doing. They're trying to address that need. Ultimately, that's why they're successful. So the antidote to that is a better identity and a better story and something better to identify with. And so that's where I would say, whatever your religious beliefs are, maybe you're not Christian, maybe you're Jewish or even Muslim, or or maybe you're Buddhist, maybe you're just in recovery and just have some general belief that there's a higher power, but you're not too specific about it. I think what I said is the core message of like the Jesus, as I understand it, is God is good. Ultimately, there's evil in the world. Evil exists. However evil came to pass and however evil operates today, it's a fact. There's some evil in the world, but there's also some good. And the ultimate reality is that good is greater than evil, and that God ultimately is the highest reality, the highest judge. And that God forgives you, loves you, wants you to forgive and love others, and grow as a person, be better, and be an instrument of good in the world. And that, I think, is a set of statements that's kind of unobjectionable, regardless of what your religious tradition is. But I'd say the story of Jesus, just this idea of, all right, and I'm going to say something, this is going to be really weird, but this is just, I'm not saying this to say that this is true. This is just another way of looking at it potentially where, kind of in the same way that what I was describing earlier about the simulation hypothesis, how that gave me like this, wait a minute, kind of dismissed in some things about, Christianity or the religious beliefs as being too contrary to, my understanding of science or history or whatever, right? But then I'm looking at this like simulation hypothesis. I'm like, well, that's one way to kind of at least analogize us to like what God's creation of the world is like in our relation from our world, if we're in a simulation, to the creator who's in some base reality, level reality, right? All right, so here's basically the story. And this is, again, just an analogy, metaphor, whatever. So don't take it literally or seriously, but it just, maybe this, after you hear it, then reflect back on the Christian message. All right, so you have, we'll just say, God is the ruler of this kingdom, realm, whatever, right? You can posit it wherever you want. A planet far, far away, And then you have this injunction against creating conscious life, against, creating a simulated reality with artificial intelligence, right? But there's this computer programmer named Satan who does that. He creates this simulation with artificially intelligent beings or conscious beings inside this simulation that he's created, right? He's and at first it's just like he's just trying to do it just to do it, but he goes bad. He because it corrupts him. He spends a lot of time in the simulation playing God, basically, and as power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? He just starts behaving more and more demonically, like toying with, being cruel towards, the conscious, AI beings in this simulation. Well, at some point, God finds out about it, shuts down the lab, but because there's some good in this simulated reality that Satan, the computer programmer, created, right? Because of that, God doesn't want to just destroy the hard drive that has the simulation on it, right? So God says, well, okay, the devil's kind of inserted himself into this as this demonic energy, because by this point, this Satan has gone completely bad. So God's got to rescue or plans to redeem whatever is good in there before destroying the hard drive, right? So God, and again, this is an analogy, metaphor. I'm not saying this is literally what it is happening or anything like that. I'm just saying it's an analogy or metaphor. And then after you hear it, look back at the Christian story. Maybe you'll see something different. Maybe you won't. But, anyway, so Satan, computer programmer, created AI in defiance of this injunction against it. Now, the good king, ruler, has shut down Satan's computer lab, and there's this hard drive that has a simulation running on it. Now, Satan has inserted himself or programmed it in such a way that some version of himself is like the king of this realm in the simulation, right? So God now has to, how do you save people who are conscious beings who are in this? How do you extract their software to where it's not contaminated by any of the evil, right? How do you, and so the thing is like anything that you present to the people within the simulation could appear to them to be part of the simulation, right? There's nothing that you can do without taking them completely out of the simulation, right? But because of the evil that exists in the simulation, God doesn't want to download any of these conscious beings into some robot in this base level reality, right? So instead what he's doing, he either inserts himself or puts lines of code in there to create people who are in some way good, right? And in doing so is able to identify those who can be made good and can in some way improve them to the point that they are then able to be downloaded or from this hard drive into a different hard drive, or a different simulation, or a robot in the base level reality, or whatever, right? But in the process of that, it's like, again, because think about how you would do this. Like, if this was a real problem that you face, like some mad computer scientist created this simulation where he basically assumed like these godlike powers, but then abused it, and he twisted everything just has this twist about it where it's like anything you can try to do to be good, he's going to try to use to do bad, right? How would you go about it? It's not necessarily a clean and easy process, right? But you feel like there's some value to some of these conscious beings in the simulation, so you want to redeem them. And so there's this process of separation within the simulation first: purification, sanctification, repentance, being changed, being transformed, before downloading, after being separated out and sanctified, the good consciousness into a separate hard drive, and then destroying the corrupted hard drive, right? Like, say you could almost look at evil in this way as like a computer virus or a biological virus. Like, it's a corruption of something that is good. It's basically what a biological virus does, or a computer virus. It hijacks, the machinery of the cell, or it hijacks the computer to make it replicate more copies of this virus so that it can then go infect other computers or infect other cells, right? Well, there's this malicious script all throughout this simulation that this mad computer scientist has created. And if that malicious script is causing the people in the simulation to do bad things and to be bad, to see things incorrectly, to want what's bad for them, or whatever, to sabotage any good that they're trying to accomplish, again, if it's, I just posit all that to say, again, not a literal statement of, I think this is actually what's going on, but just as an analogy, right? A metaphor, a parable, a symbol to say, look at the world that we live in. You see, a lot of times where evil seems to triumph, good seems to be crushed. How is it that you have somebody like Jesus come along and preach what he preaches, and then you have people that take that and somehow turn it into the Spanish Inquisition or the Salem witch trials or whatever, right? I just say that there's other ways of looking at the Christian message, the Christian story, that there's a real reality to it. And so if you are able to re-encounter that in a new way and embrace it, not for a religious identity, but for a conviction that I am in a relationship with a good God who loves and cares for me and for others and wants me to improve, forgives me where I've fucked up, and empowers me to do better and to forgive others and to help them to do better, right? And Jesus is this example of that, based on his life, based on his death, based on his resurrection. That story, without piling on top of it a bunch of religious doctrines about, God sure doesn't like it if you drink on Sundays or to drink at all, right? It's like, well, I don't know about that because Jesus turned water into wine according to the Bible too, so I don't know, right? Like, you start piling on all these additional doctrines. God doesn't like you to see certain movies or listen to certain music or whatever. Just kind of like, not to say that you can't decide that for yourself and have a conviction, but if you're talking to your kids are good about seeing through bullshit. And then especially in our society where there's so much bullshit floating around and so many people are tending to know things that really don't know what they're talking about. Like, don't lie to your kids. Don't pretend to know more than you know. And people, when they do this, it's not that they're necessarily intending to do that, because people lie to themselves to convict, because doubt is not a comfortable thing. Uncertainty, the what if, what I believe is not true, that's not a fun thing to consider, right? So admit what you don't know, and that allows it to be more meaningful when you do say what you do know, what you do believe, what is most essential about your identity as, a believer. And so anyway, wrapping this up, and I apologize, it's been kind of rambling and all over the place. But again, if to win the culture war, again, and the culture war isn't even the main thing. It's a real distraction. But to keep those we love, especially our children, from being casualties of the culture war, right, you need to give them an identity that is solid, that they don't go out in the world and now they're like half of a person because they don't really have a strong identity and they're looking for an identity and they fall prey to all these demagogues who want to give them an identity with all these strings attached. I mean, just look at the movie Pinocchio, the Disney movie Pinocchio, if you remember that, right? The kids going to Pleasure Island. Boy, that film couldn't be made today. Because there you have like the kids, once they're on Pleasure Islands, drinking beer and smoking cigars and playing pool. But of course, there's some strings attached. They turn into donkeys, right? To be sold into slavery or whatever, right? Or hard labor in the mines, whatnot, right? Like, that's what happens, and metaphorically, but that's what happens if you go out in the world without a solid identity and you look to other people to give you one secondhand, right? It's just going to be nothing but bad things. But if, on the other hand, you give your kid a solid, like, and you're honest with them, this is what I believe and this is why I believe it, and this is what I know, and there's a lot I don't know, and this is what my values are, and you kind of have to work through this process for yourself, but just know this: God is good, God loves you, God forgives you where you err, where you come back to Him, He wants you to come back, He forgives you, He cleanses your heart, however many times it takes. And He'll use you as an instrument of good in the world to be a better person, to live a more abundant, full life, and to help those around you live a more abundant, full life, right? That is a story. If you can get your kids to embrace that, that is the best defense they can have against the identity culture and all the other garbage that's out there. You know, basically, it would, to use the words of the Bible, that would steal, kill, and destroy them. You know, to steal and kill and destroy their sense of being and purpose and all that and goodness, right? So maybe this is kind of a religious message or a spiritual message. I guess ultimately that's what it is, because really a lot of these battles, going back to the Bible, it's not against flesh and blood, but powers and principalities and dark forces of wickedness in the heavenly realms, right? I think that's however that is. Whatever reality that's expressing, and a lot of these things in the Bible, I think that people saw or felt things that they didn't have words for, and so they did what they could with the words that they had and used stories and images, right? But it captures something very real, and that's true. You look at the world that we're in, to just believe that this is just, everything is as it appears on the surface, and that the answer is like to fight the worldly evil with worldly good, or the opposite in the world itself, and to not use or not tap into or acknowledge a spiritual reality is a fatal flaw, right? And so, and this is one of the things where on the right, and at this point in history, a lot of craziness is coming from the left. Team Red can also be crazy. I'm not naive about that. But one problem that some people have in countering wokeness, there is and it's kind of like the Enlightenment philosophy, the new atheists maybe. It's kind of, to me, it's like the Libertarian Party in the United States, where there's always a hardcore percentage of people, but it's a small percentage, and they're really not very influential, you know? And so it's like you can have, you know, and this is the thing, Sam Harris, who I've benefited a lot from. His book on waking up, or I believe waking up, like spirituality without religion, and even his waking up app, you know, meditation app and all that. I got benefited a lot from it. But at the end of the day, I kind of see like there's only so far that takes you in terms of your life. Now, again, I don't know. I can't answer for Sam Harris or what, you know, but I was saying for myself in my own life, you know, quieting my mind, you know, recognizing the non-dual nature of consciousness or whatever, right? Like those are good insights to have, but I feel like they only take you so far. And if you think that you can save the world with that message, I think that's naive, because I just don't see that as being something that the majority of people can really embrace and that will allow them to navigate the world well when there's so much bullshit out there. Like, you need something deeper than that. We're human beings. There's a reason why stories, whatever it is, we don't retain, logical syllogisms the way we retain a story. And so there's something about finding a story that you really relate to. And again, going back to the story of Jesus, I think that's the best that I've come across, that captures something very real and ultimately a source of an identity that can withstand the bullshit in the culture. So, hey, if you listen to this, and this is Monday, February 21st, 2022, I'm Daniel D. Also do the Crazy Comedy, Humor, and Satire podcast, which is a lot different than this. This is the What's Wrong with America podcast. But yeah, if you hear this, you disagree, if you think I'm missing something or I'm wrong, let me know by all means. My email for this podcast is www.podcast@gmail.com. Again, that's whiskey alpha podcast@gmail.com. Or connect with me on social. There's a Facebook page for the What's Wrong with America podcast. I'm on Twitter under Daniel D Humor, on Getter under Daniel D Comedy. So anyway, connect with me there. Let me know what you think. If you think I'm full of shit, hey, you won't be the first person that's thought that or told me that, and I'm open to whatever it is you have to say. Or if you think that, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting is to see ideas or insights get synthesized, because sometimes you take an idea that's in one realm and transfer it to a different realm and really have a real breakthrough for yourself. An example of this, and this is kind of off the subject, but Cesar Millan, right? I had gotten a dog at one point. Still have the dog, but at one point I was like, I'm going to try to train this dog, and so I watched the dog whisperer stuff and got Cesar Millan's book about like the Caesar's way. Well, anyway, one of his insights was like, you have these American dogs, they're pampered, they live easy lives, but that's not how dogs are really meant to live, right? Because dogs descended from these wild wolves. Like, you look at their ancestors, you look at their relatives in the wild, like they live in a pack with other dogs. They have this hierarchy. They know their place in the pack. They are constantly moving. They're like a typical wolf pack will travel long distances every day, right? So Cesar Millan was saying like dogs need exercise, discipline, and affection in that order, right? And he's talking about how it may seem like your dog should be happy, right? Because it's like, oh, you're living this great life. You're well fed. Everything needs taken care of. You can just lounge around the house all day, go out in the yard, when you need to use the bathroom or whatever, right? But he's like, that's hell for a dog. Like, because that's not what dogs are made for, really. It's like for the dog to really be happy, one, you have to like be the pack leader in the house. You got to set boundaries for the dog. You got to exercise the dog, like walk the dog, jog with the dog, even put the dog on a treadmill or whatever. Like, dogs are happier when they're exercising, right? And so I read that and heard that, and I was like, you know what? That's true of human beings too, because, right? Like, look at how we live as a species for most of our history. Either in these small hunter-gatherer tribes or small farming villages or whatever, right? Where everybody knew everybody, where the need to impress strangers with small talk and wow them over and convince them to give you money was not ever something that people needed to worry about, right? And yet today, you look at the way we live today, and how fake or artificial, a lot of our lives are, in terms of these social constructs, the technology. I mean, now they're wanting people to spend time in a metaverse, right? Like, there's all these things, and at the end of the day, it's like those things that typify human existence for most of our history as a species are largely lacking in modern society. Like, modern society is just not conducive for building up close bonds with like a tribe of people. And I don't mean tribe in the sense of tribalism like what we see in politics. That's a counterfeit of it. But in terms of you being, you living in a village where you're friends with, or all your family's nearby and your friends are nearby, and you live your whole life around the same people, and you're able to really have these deep, rich relationships. There's not a lot of small talk, but there's real meaningful talk, right? People know each other and care about each other. Like, that's huge. The fact that we don't really have that in modern times, and I think that's why a lot of people, like, there's a high rate of suicide for veterans, for example, like coming back from overseas. I think, and I didn't really do a whole lot overseas myself, so I can't speak to the trauma that some people may have, but I think a large part of that is, like, when you're overseas, like, you got a group of people around you. You get in these deep relationships with people, and you know they got your back, you got their back, right? But then you come home, nobody gives a fuck about anybody. I'll just be honest. Like, you live in a suburban neighborhood, you may know. I mean, it's not like you're rude to people, but you'll wave and say hi. But as far as like really knowing each other in a deep and meaningful way, chances are you don't even know your neighbors like that. Especially if you live in a city. So that's a profound difference, right? So I brought that up just to say that you can have these insights in one area and move them on to a different area, and it opens up something for you. So anyway, I think with a lot of the stuff with Christianity, I've come back around to it in part because some of these things from other areas, like the simulation hypothesis having to do with computers and AI and technology, I'm like, you know what? It's some really interesting now to revisit. Not to say that it 100% maps on, but as an analogy, as a metaphor. Like, it helps you to see a dimension of this that maybe you didn't see before. So anyway, I just say all that to say, I think if you're not Christian, I'm not trying to convert you to anything, but just if you're a human being, you need an identity, right? And identity can either be meaningful, in which case it's probably going to be hard, or it's going to be easy, but if it's easy, it's probably going to be empty, right? And so whether it takes the form of a recovery group, or whether it takes the form of like a Christian church, or whether it takes whatever, like, it's worth considering this, because this is an identity and a story that has stood the test of time in a lot of different cultures, times, and places. And people have found a lot of strength and meaning, and grace and all that from. And so it's worth not just tossing it out, but coming back to it. G.K. Chesterton talks about this with in his book, I think, Orthodoxy. He talks about there's two ways to come to, to an appreciation of your hometown. One is to never leave it. You just always love it and appreciate it. And the other is like to feel this itch, like, oh, there's got to be more. And you travel the whole world looking for it. And then you come back home and you see it in a new way that you didn't appreciate before because of what you've seen and been through and all that. And now you see it from a different angle and you're like, oh, there is this real beauty and goodness to it that I kind of overlooked, right? I think there's something similar here in our modern age with the Christian story, specifically. And again, how that would look living it out, I'm not advocating for any particular church or any particular set of practices, but I just say that and here's an example of this, is kind of Monty Python and the Life of Brian. Kind of an irreverent film, but when you look at it, the stuff that Jesus says is not treated like it's absurd or made fun of at all. Like, the humor comes from the people's reaction to the stuff Jesus says and does. And if you watch that film, that's the way it's presented. It's not Jesus that's presented as this buffoon, but it's like some of the people who misinterpret and manipulate for their own ends the things that Jesus says and does that are presented in a ridiculous way. Or another example of this is a movie, which is actually a pretty good one, with Steve Martin, Leap of Faith, which actually was based on, in some ways, this documentary about this guy, Marjo Gortner. But anyway, the Leap of Faith movie. Interesting twist on it, because it's like, again, you have this guy, he's like this televangelist, but he doesn't really believe it. He's one of those, like, in the 80s, this was a big thing. Again, these flashy, guys that had their own cable news show, and, they'd be dressed to the nines and flying private jets and everything else, right? And And there was this idea that, well, these people, maybe they don't really believe what they're saying. They're not so sincere. Maybe they're hypocritical. Maybe they're just in it for the money. It's hard to tell sometimes. And so it's not really a surprise when some of them, it turns out, were just in it for the money and we're not actually good people or living good lives. But anyway, in this movie, Leap of Faith, Steve Martin, this televangelist, he's kind of jaded by the whole thing. But at some point where he's in this town, because one of the buses breaks down, they're on this traveling revival. So they set up a tent. They start having these revivals, right? People come. But there's this kid who actually really believes it, and he comes and experiences some kind of healing, which that actually happens. Whatever else you believe or don't believe, I'm not saying it happens all the time, and I'm not saying I know why it happens in some cases and not others, but people actually have had, and I've seen it with my own eyes, like people that actually have had real changes to their bodies, their lives, their minds in a way that seems miraculous. Okay, so I'm not going to try to say that I understand why and how it works. But in this particular instance, this kid really believes it. He is somehow, something happens with him where he experiences some healing. Now if you could give a medical explanation as to the psychosomatic reasons for it or whatever, so I'm not arguing about any of that. All I'm saying is like this kid really believed he really experiences healing. So then Steve Martin's character sees this and it kind of convicts him in some way where he's like, all right, I got to get out of this racket because I'm in it for all the wrong reasons. And this kid, he's the real deal. So it really convicted me and I got to get my life together before I try to do anything else, right? But there's this thing in that movie where there's this acknowledgement where even if the people themselves doing something are doing it for the wrong reasons, even if most of the people involved in it are even kind of deluded or doing stuff for the wrong reasons, even if there's a lot of it that you can dismiss as in a kind of contemptuous or laughably absurd way as like, oh, whatever, that's ridiculous, right? Yet, God or something can still work through that, right? Like, even though it's a corrupt instrument, God could still use it to, like, if somebody goes to, and this is something that I really do believe, if you go really seeking God, really with the open heart, and you go to wherever it is, hiking in the mountains or the beach, just watching the sky and the waves. Don't do it during a hurricane, but just go to the beach, or you go to church, or you go to a synagogue or whatever. If you really are seeking God, and this is why you're there, because I think God can, whatever the situation is, God can use something in that to reach you, to interact with you in some very real and very meaningful way. And so that's all. I guess if there's a point to this, is just be open to that if you don't feel like you have it. And for your children, give them that story, encourage them on it. Don't be dogmatic about it. Don't lie to them and tell them that you know more than you do. Don't say, don't ask questions, just shut up and believe. But really say, like, okay, explore by all means, because we live in a crazy world, but God is greater and God is better. God is good, right? So explore knowing God is going to be with you. But really take that seriously. God is good. Somehow, however you embrace it or make sense of it, the Christian story, right? I do believe that's the way out of this whole mess with our culture, with all the craziness. We live in a culture of death right now. All the wrong values being espoused, right? What Jesus said about the devil coming to steal, kill, and destroy. You can use that phrase to describe a lot of the things and the people and the movements and all that that's out there. But Jesus came that we might have life and have it more abundantly. So whatever that's worth to you, this is just a thing that I would say. I think that's what I've seen. That's the best way forward, is to embrace that in your own way, however that looks. All right. So anyway, my name is Daniel D. Hope you enjoyed that. This is the What's Wrong with America podcast. Went a lot long today. So anyway, I don't know if it'll be as long next week. I know, I guess that's the beauty of podcasts. You're not on a time frame, and people can listen if they got the time, and if they don't have the time, they don't have to listen. But next week we'll talk about something else. Anyway, hope you guys have a great week. God bless you. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. It's available if you're listening to this on YouTube or Facebook. You can find this podcast in pretty much any podcasting app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, whatever you use. Subscribe to the podcast there in case I get kicked off of YouTube. Who knows? Or Facebook. Their little terms of conditions, it seems to be always changing and always being used as a cudgel to silence certain perspectives from being shared. So anyway, go to a podcasting app if you have one, and subscribe to the podcast there so you don't miss out on any future episodes. But anyway, till next time, peace out.